Today, we're going to take a deeper dive into using maneuver nodes with the contract Position a Satellite in an Equatorial Orbit of Kerbin. In fact, we're going to do two. These contracts require us to position satellites in very specific orbits, affording us an opportunity to look at the uses of the other directions on the maneuver node tool, specifically the normal and radial directions. We will also be looking at how to budget for missions like these, given that the delta V maps aren't useful here. And we'll finish off by looking at how to recover from a less than precise insertion and still fulfill the contract requirements in a fuel efficient way. Let's get started. We'll start by taking a look at our contracts. As mentioned, I do have two of them to position satellite in an equatorial orbit of Kerbin, and we'll get into the objectives here. And right away, there's something that you have to be careful about. Please note that this must be a new unmanned probe built for VACCO Advanced Suction Systems after the contract is accepted. And both of these say the same thing, though the actual provider of the contract changes, though that doesn't really change anything. But the key word here is the word new. You can't just build one probe and then send that to the first orbit and then use that same probe and take it over to the second orbit. That doesn't work. They each have to be separate vessels. So be careful about that one. Going down our orbital specifics, we have a specific apoapsis, a specific periapsis, and a specific inclination, which is just 0, so that's just straight over the equator. That's as easy as that one comes. And then don't miss these ones down here. Anyone who's watched my streams for a while know that I get burned on this one, on the fine print, as it were. We'll build a new unmanned probe that has an antenna, can generate power, so that means solar panels, and the probe must be fully assembled when launched. So you're not putting stuff together in orbit or anything like that if you enjoy doing those kind of things. Has to be a single launch and get to where you want to go. Reach the designated equatorial orbit around Kerbin within reasonable deviation. It's actually pretty generous, I think, with this. We'll get to that in a little bit. Notice the third one, though, have a thermometer on the satellite. You often get these extra little bits that need to be there. Don't miss them. Even if the thermometer's not going to do anything, needs to be there to satisfy this contract. And then maintain stability for 10 seconds. So after you've achieved your orbit, just turn everything off, and if it stays in that orbit for 10 seconds, there's no reason why it wouldn't, then the contract should satisfy. And of course, you get an advance, you get money upon completion, including some science and some reputation. If we take a look at the second one, it's much the same sort of thing, some different numbers here. There is one extra bit of information. We need to have an argument of periapsis of 352 degrees, which sounds really technical, but it's not a big deal. What it's really just telling you is that the periapsis of this orbit does have to be in a specific location. More on that later. The rest of this, though, it doesn't have any science equipment or anything you got to add on. The rest of it is exactly the same as the other one. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this one first, because this one doesn't have the argument of periapsis business, and then we will do the second of those contracts and talk about how to get that argument of periapsis. All right. There is some science I do want to unlock for this one. We're now into this tier right here. So starting up here towards the top, I want to get propulsion systems because it gives you lots of these little itty bitty engines and itty bitty tanks. I gotta like that. We are also going to get advanced construction. Lots of nice parts in here, but the one I'm really eyeing is this AE-FF1 Airstream Protective Shell. This is a protective fairing for your payloads, great for small payloads. And then working our way down here towards the bottom, I have miniaturization. And the part I really want out of this one is the TS-A6 stack separator. So if you're going to follow along, do make sure you have these nodes unlocked. All right, let's get started with our build. I'm going to draw our attention down here to the bottom right before we get started, and specifically this little contract window. You can pin this here. if you have a mission where you have contracts with very specific parameters, it's really nice to have this open while you are in the middle of your build. You can close the ones that aren't relevant to what it is that you are doing. And some of these, notice there's little pluses that you can open up here to give you more information. This one in particular has some apoapsis and periapsis you need to hit. But we're going to do this one here with the higher periapsis and apoapsis because it doesn't, again, have that argument of periapsis. What I'm just going to do is I'm going to actually build a probe to do this, and then that probe will easily be able to do the other one because it's of a lower altitude. So let's get started. Our own, well, that's not true. We do have the Stay Put Nick, but our better probe body is the Probodyne Octo Probe Core, so that's going to allow us to do that. And then we got to do some power generation, and what I like to do is any amount of solar panels will do, but what I find works really nicely is if I go to 6-way symmetry and then turn the panels this way, they seem to surround these probe bodies in an attractive way. So that's on 6-way symmetry. Even though this is an octo probe core, it doesn't really matter. We're going to put on a battery, because it's always good to have a battery on board. You don't need to have a lot, that's going to do it. This also requires you to have an antenna. If we take a look down here somewhere, I know it mentioned an antenna. I know it's there, so I'm going to do it. And we're going to use the Commutron 16, and we're going to put just one of them on, because that's all we need. And if you hold the Alt key, it'll snap to that node. So there's a nice antenna for us there. And also, while I'm thinking about it, this has to have a thermometer. So over to science, we're going to put on a little bit of a thermometer, and we'll just stick it on. We might move this in just a little bit. So this at least now matches or meets all the requirements of our contract here. All we got to do is get it up to this orbit. Now, how do we know how much delta V we require in order to get our apoapsis and periapsis up to this number? Well, I do have some math videos if you actually want to learn how to calculate this yourself, but we're going to do something that's quite a lot easier. I'm going to take this probe, I'm going to launch it as it is right now, and we're going to enter into the cheat menu by holding Alt and pressing F12. And if we go down here to a little tab here called Cheats, there's another one here called Set Orbit. And technically, I don't consider this a cheat, because what we're going to do is use this to help do our planning, and then we're going to revert back. We're not going to complete the mission this way. So what we can do is we can take any object and set it in orbit basically anywhere you want. You can select your body up here at the top. We're going to stick obviously with Kerbin, and then you can put in your parameters for that orbit. The top one here is really the only one we need to look at, the semi-major axis. The semi-major axis is the average between your periapsis and apoapsis when they are measured from Kerbin's center. That's an important thing to recognize with this number. Not measured above sea level, but measured from the center of the parent body itself. Kerbin has a radius of 600 kilometers or 600,000 meters. This is in meters right here. So this 686,750, well, if you subtract off the 600,000, you're left with 86,750. That's going to be the altitude of our orbit. Because we're keeping the eccentricity, which is how elliptical the orbit is, a 0 is a perfect circle. You can go up, well, you want a number between 0 and 1 if you want to keep it as an orbit. And we can look at these other numbers later, but basically this is going to create an orbit that's circular with an altitude of 86,750 meters. It would be nice if we could get this to be smaller, but actually this is the lowest that the game will let you set that. It considers anything below that dangerous, even though the atmosphere is actually at 70 kilometers, but whatever. So we're going to leave it as this number, and we're going to simply say set orbit. And we're going to get rid of this menu. And here we are sitting in our orbit. Wasn't that easy? Right? We're not going to stay here. We're not cheating. We're using this for planning purposes only. So I'm going to go into map view. So let's get rid of stuff we don't want to see. There we go. So there's us in our orbit. This is our first orbit, the lower orbit we got to get to. But this purple one is the orbit for the contract we're going to do first. And if I can get to this purple one, I can definitely get to the green one with my second probe. So how do I figure out how much delta V it's going to require? Well, actually, it's pretty easy. If I have maneuver nodes unlocked, all I got to do is go anywhere along here, go add a maneuver, and simply pull that prograde until we get the apoapsis of the resulting orbit up to our target orbit. Now, you don't have to do this precisely. This is just for planning purposes. But basically, this is going to be our plan. We're going to create a burn. We're going to go up here towards the right altitude for our orbit. And then up here, we're going to create a second burn. And if I click up here, it allows you to add a second maneuver. And we can burn prograde here. And that's causing this orbit to expand out. And again, I'm just doing this, that's close enough. We're not doing anything precise. We'll round this all up anyway. But between this burn and this burn, I will be pretty close to being in the orbit, my target orbit there. Now all I gotta do is look at what did those two burns cost. Now be a little bit careful looking at this. This here will only show you what the first burn is if you have more than one burn going. So this first burn is 754.4. Let's round, I'm gonna round everything up to the nearest 10. Let's call that 760 meters per second for our first burn. Well, what about for the second burn? Well, there's two things you can do. You can actually delete this burn and it'll show you the second burn, or you can go down here and you can see it's on maneuver number 2. You can switch between the two maneuvers using these two guys here. For maneuver number 2, notice that it is, we got a 440.7 odd meters per second just in the prograde part, and nothing here and nothing here. We will be talking about these before the end of this video, but for now they're not adding anything to this. So we can see here that this is 441 meters per second, or if I again round up to the nearest 10, we'll call that 450. So we got a 760 plus 450, giving us a total of 1,210. That should be able to do it. So we're done here. We're simply going to hit the escape key and we're going to revert our flight back to vehicle assembly because we're not going to cheat. Now it's going to be time for us to get up there for real. So thus far we got 1,210 meters per second for our budget. It's also very common to get contracts that actually get you to move these at a later date. So it's not a bad idea to actually put in a little bit more than that. So actually, I'm going to add on another 500 meters per second onto that for a total of 1,710 meters per second. And then getting into orbit. Now lately, I've been budgeting 4,000 meters per second for that up until now, but you're probably starting to find that you can get yourself up into orbit for a lot less than that. So I'm going to start bringing that number down. And if you want to, it's very easy for you to take a look at what your total delta V is of your rocket, practice putting it in orbit, and see what your delta V is after you put it in orbit. Subtract those two numbers, and it's just what it costs to put you in orbit, and find out what your cost is for putting it into orbit based on how you do it. But I'm going to budget another 3,800 meters per second for putting us in orbit. That gets us a total of 5,510 meters per second. Okay, let's start putting some fuel on this thing and see how we do. So we're going to go over to fuel tanks, and I now have the Oscar B fuel tank. This is my smallest itty bitty little fuel tank. It's one of the smallest fuel tanks in the game. We're just going to put that on there like that, and then I'm going to go to engines. I got a couple of, actually there's a few new engines. I have the Spark liquid fuel engine, which has 20 kilonewtons of thrust, and then I also have this, the LV-1 Ant liquid fuel engine with its tiny 2 kilonewtons of thrust. It's always a great idea to start small and work up. Use the smallest engine you can get away with. That's that much less for you to lift. Okay, we'll put that on. We'll take a look at our stats. Don't forget to put this onto vacuum. And you can see we already have 2,181 meters per second of delta V. We're already getting close to half of what we need. So pretty excited by that. If I take a look at the thrust to weight ratio, it's 0.52. So well under 1. That is completely fine. Once you are in orbit, thrust to weight ratios aren't a big deal. A thrust to weight ratio of about 0.5 is perfectly functional. So there's no reason for us to put a bigger engine on it than this. We're just going to go exactly with what you see here. And I changed the engine texture, added on some blinky lights, and played with the new flags that I just unlocked. Sweet. Okay, there we go. We got ourselves a nice, sweet little probe. Now we got to build a booster to get that into orbit. So I'm going to go over to our decoupling section, And we got some new decouplers. I now have the TS-6 stack separator, and I picked this one because it is a 0.625 meter part. Previous to this one, the smallest one I had was the TD-12 decoupler, which is the bigger one. I don't like this bigger one. I want to use the smaller one for this itty bitty little probe. Now, just to talk very briefly about what's the difference between a decoupler and a separator. This is a decoupler. Take a look at the triangle here. The triangle is telling you what part is going to get let go. So the little arrows pointing to that it will let go of this probe. This will remain attached to the rest of the rocket. The little base of the triangle tells you how it's going to remain attached. With a separator, notice that, let's try and zoom in here again. Barely see it, but there are two triangles here, and they're pointing both ways. So that means it's going to detach on both sides. So that's the difference between a decoupler and a separator. The separator will actually separate itself as well. I actually kind of prefer the decouplers because this separator will just become more debris floating around in space. If you're into debris, that's great. But unfortunately, I don't have a 0.625 meter decoupler yet, so we're going to have to be using that. Okay, now let's enclose this into a protective shell. So we'll retract the antenna. I'm going to go under payload, and I have now the AE-FF1 Airstream Protective Shell. I'm going to stick that underneath here, and right away you get this, you can start to construct a fairing. So you can go up, and when you click, that completes that particular section, and then you can keep going. You want it to come sort of to a point, and notice it says here LMB, left mouse button, you can use to close the fairing, and that's about it. So what I got here now is a nice kind of protective shell over it. You can, if you don't like what you got, you can delete that fairing and you can do it again. Just to show you, also hit build fairing. You can, this fairing is affected by the snap. If we take the snap off, this is a little bit more fine now. Snap on, it snaps to different locations. I want to go straight up, so I'm going to put the snap on. And then if I take the snap off, now this is very fine tuning here. I'll build pretty much the same thing. Let's take a look at some of the other bits that are here as well. You can up the number of sides. This is that's really handy when you get bigger fairings to put on more sides. With this really small fairing, 2 sides is enough. You can also change the ejection force, how much force is used to expel the fairing. Again, with large fairings, upping that is really useful. With smaller fairings, it doesn't matter so much. You can put on clamshell deploy. The default is, I think, what's affectionately referred to as confetti mode, where bits of fairing go flying off everywhere, and that's the end of that. I don't know. I don't think it looks so well. Clamshell means that this is going to go off in 2 separate halves. It will split, and one half will go one way and the other half will go the other way. I think that looks better. Again, if you want to improve the number of sides, you can. This would now split off into thirds that way. But if you want that shells coming off, you got to put on the clamshell deploy. Fairing expansion. Notice how the fairing expands when I put the mouse over it. I can turn that off if I don't like that anymore. And you know what, we'll get into the other settings here in a little bit. You can also change up the textures a little bit and try different color. Here, we'll go with that one. That looks pretty good. Okay, so there we go. We're in a nice sort of a payload here. As for the booster, well, it is identical to the core booster of the rocket that first took Jeb into orbit, consisting of 3 FL-T400 fuel tanks with a swivel engine on the bottom, and then 4 basic tail fins for stability, and 1 other new part. We're going to have no trouble steering while this engine is firing because of the gimbling on our engine, but once this engine is turned off, it's not going to help us steer. Now, up at the top in this Octo probe core, there are reaction wheels, but the reaction wheels in the Octo probe core are only 0.3 kilonewton meters. That would be the unit, but very, very small. To give a point of comparison, we've been using the Mark 1 command pod a lot, and it has reaction wheels that are more than 10 times as powerful as in the Octo. So this thing might have a little bit of trouble steering once the engine is off. So to help that, we're going to go over to Command and Control, our first time in this tab, and underneath here we have small inline reaction wheels. And what we're going to do is we're going to put these, and notice it's a 0.625 meter part. I'm going to grab right here, We're going to put them right underneath that decoupler, and we're going to put this back. Make sure that the fairing is still okay. I think the fairing is still good. Yes, it is. And I put these not on the probe because the probe's going to have no trouble steering with the tiny reaction wheels that are in the probe body, but the whole rocket might have some issues, so I put in some reaction wheels here. And it doesn't make any difference, by the way, where you put them. I used to think that it was important for you to put the reaction wheels close to the center of mass, and from a physics standpoint it certainly is, but the game will take this force of reaction and place it at the center of mass for you automatically, whether the reaction wheels are there or not, so you don't really have to worry about it. And with the addition of some more decals and a final tweaking of the thrust limiter to give us an appropriate launch thrust to weight ratio, we are ready to go. And the first goal here is simply to get into orbit, which we've done lots of times before. I am being careful to keep my heading as close to 90 degrees as I can. Remember, for both of these contracts, I require to place the satellites into orbits with an inclination of 0, and that becomes a lot easier if I can keep my heading due east during my orbital insertion. By the way, at the end of this video, I'm going to look at the situation of what if you completely botch that? What if you are still working on controlling that rocket during your ascent and are having trouble keeping it on due east? Well, don't worry, I got you covered. That's going to be at the end of this video. In the meantime, I do want to welcome aboard my most recent patron, Terran East. Thank you very much, Terran, for your support and for the ongoing support of all of my Patreon patrons and YouTube members. You can see all of their names in the credits at the end of the video. So, at some point we're going to want to lose our fairing. If you have already cut your thrust, it's advantageous to hang on to this fairing until you're pretty much out of the atmosphere. The extra mass is helping you overcome the aerodynamic drag that is on this thing. So you might as well just hang on to the fairing. However, if you are still under thrust and you are at a high altitude, which can happen with low thrust upper stages, another topic for a future episode, it actually becomes advantageous to get rid of these just to lose the mass. But because we are not under thrust, we're going to hang on to these. Oh well, we might as well let go of them now. Here we go. Let's go. Beautiful. There they go in that clamshell deploy. I like that. There we are. Okay, we even still have a little bit left in this stage. Might as well make use of that. And I'm going to just put this onto this normal. Those reaction wheels are working really nicely for me, helping me orient this craft. Without these reaction wheels right here, this would be a little more awkward to whip around like that. All right, let's get ourselves out to our orbit. So again, let's get rid of superfluous information. We are aiming for this orbit rather than this green one, and then we'll do the green one next. We do have a specific apoapsis to aim for and a specific periapsis to aim for. It really doesn't matter because if we open up our contract, here are our orbital parameters in our contract. There is no mention of an argument of periapsis, which is telling you that actually, although the periapsis and apoapsis do have to be these numbers, they don't have to be in this location. That said, we have this nice orbit for us to aim for. Why don't we actually aim for that orbit? So we're going to aim for getting the apoapsis of our orbit up to this periapsis. I'm going to click on our orbit. I'm going to add a maneuver here. And notice that as I'm adding in prograde to my maneuver, my apoapsis is going up, that the number down here shows what the apoapsis is going to be after I perform the maneuver, not my current apoapsis. I would like this apoapsis to meet this periapsis. Now this periapsis is 4,852, or 53, I guess, if I round up, kilometers. So I would like our apoapsis to be that. So I'm just going to pull, looking down at my apoapsis till it's 4,853. There we go. Oh, that's really, really close. Of course, we can dial this in even better if we want to. You do not have to be super precise with this. It's definitely close enough. And although it's not necessary for this contract, why don't we do it anyway? I'm going to put my apoapsis right on top of the periapsis. So I do that by simply adjusting the timing. Remember, you can do that down here by moving forward just in 1 second intervals. There we go. And so that's going to be the first part of our burn. 3, 2, 1, and go. Pushing Z and stage. And we're off. Barely anything out of that stage. And now our thrust to weight ratio has gone down quite a lot. That's why this burn is taking as long as it is. But as far as performing the mission, that doesn't matter. All it does is it just makes it take a little bit longer. If you're getting bored, you can hold the Alt key and push period to go into physics warp. I'm now going at 2 times speed to get this over with a little bit more quickly. You can go all the way up to 4 times speed, but of course the faster you go, the tougher this thing is going to be to control. So do be a little bit careful with that. And we're just going to burn until this keeps changing on me, our apoapsis gets up to 4,853. And I'm going to just watch it from here. You don't have to, do not have to do this always from map view. And I think personally, it's prettier from this view. And we're going to start reducing our throttle. Take your time. Again, there's no rush with this stuff. Once you're in orbit, everything can be done slowly. A little bit more thrust, though. Going a little bit too low. What are we going for? 4,853. So I'm really looking more at my orbital data than I am at anything else. So 4,800. I'm not even looking at, there we go, close. Okay, that's a little bit, I'm actually more than close enough right here with this number. In fact, I'm rather excited by that. So I'll take a look, get rid of this. Okay, we are on a trajectory on our way out to this orbit way out here. And so now what we need to do is to perform a burn out here at our apoapsis that will be stretching out this orbit so that it matches the purple orbit. And I wouldn't go so much with, just look at the orbit. You just need to match it. There we go. Going to just come out to about here, and I want my apoapsis to match up with that apoapsis. Now, if you want to be really picky about the numbers, our apoapsis needs to be 5,241-ish, so you can take a look down here where it's giving you the prediction for that. You can go to you're at 5,241. But you don't need to be as precise as this. It really doesn't matter. I'm noticing my apoapsis is not at the same place as this apoapsis. Doesn't matter, again, for this particular contract, but if you want it to be there, you just do that by adjusting the timing. See how that brings it over there? Moving a little bit ahead in time. And then it's just a matter of time warping up there and completing this final burn. And as I close into the end of this, I'm going to reduce my throttle, and I'm really looking up there at the contract at the top right more than I am at the maneuver node. And I'm just going to go until I see things go green. When you get the parameters close enough, all of a sudden you get a little check mark saying it's gone green. So I'm just burning slowly, waiting for it to go green, and then I'm cutting my throttle. I don't care what the maneuver node said. I don't even care what this data says. The key here is getting this contract. Then it's just waiting 10 seconds, and this last one should go green, and there we go. Our contract is now complete. So let's go back to the Space Center and launch the other one. And as mentioned, this is an identical vehicle to the first one. I didn't even bother taking the thermometer off because I just don't care. This is going to get the job done, and that's all I care about. The main thing that's different about this contract is that the orbital parameters do contain an argument for the periapsis. And what that means is that the periapsis of our orbit has to be in the location that's shown in the animated orbit that we see. However, if I just follow the exact same procedure as we did in the previous insertion, that will all get taken care of automatically. Again, we're going to aim for putting apoapsis of our orbit to match up with our periapsis. Now, if people are wondering, could I do it the other way around? Could I get my apoapsis to instead match up with this apoapsis? The answer to that question is yes, you can. It'll work just as well. However, you will find that it is a tad bit more efficient to go for the periapsis first, and that's because prograde burns are the most efficient the closest you are to your parent body. So you want to keep these prograde burns at as low an altitude as you can. And if I went for apoapsis first, it's at a slightly higher altitude. Okay, the rest of this is exactly the same as before, concluding with reducing our thrust during the final part of that final insertion and just waiting for the orbital parameters on that contract to go green. And there we go. Okay, it's checked off. We wait for 10 seconds. And then this maneuver is complete with still a ton of delta V if I ever want to move this around to a different location. There we go. Contract is now complete. But now comes the question, that all went very, very well, but what if I really botched something? What if my orbital insertion just stank? How do I fix the situation that I just put myself in? It's not a problem. So here I have the exact same rocket, except this time I didn't pay too much attention to my heading during my ascent. And if I go over here to the advanced orbital info, I'm in an inclination of 5.6 degrees. I'm probably going to have to change that in order to satisfy this particular contract, which requires me to have an inclination of 0 degrees. So let's go back to trying to set this up. Now, what I was doing before is I was placing my maneuver so that I got the apoapsis of my transfer orbit up here and meeting up with the periapsis. That's so that I can get the periapsis and the apoapsis of my final orbit in the right spot, because this thing, after all, does have an argument of periapsis requirement. However, now I am off. Notice that here, if I look at the descending, at this little dn and this little an, the little dn stands for descending node. This is where my orbit is going from north to south across the plane of my target orbit, and it's telling me I am crossing at an angle of 6 degrees. Over on the opposite side, I have an AN, which is where my orbit is crossing the plane of my target orbit. And of course, the magnitude of that angle is still the same, 6 degrees, except now it's a positive, it's going up. I need to get that very close to being 0. So how are we going to do that? Well, what I need to do is make myself an inclination change. To make an inclination change, what you need to do is to put a maneuver very close to where this ascending node or descending node is, so perhaps around here. And then instead of using prograde or retrograde, which is what we've been doing so far, we got to use these two, which are called the positive normal. The one that goes northwards in this particular case is the positive normal. The ones that goes to the south is the negative normal. And if I pull this, or sometimes called the anti-normal, if I pull the anti-normal to kind of pull, see how that pulls this down? I can start to get my inclination. If we take a look here, you can see that my inclination here is changing and getting smaller. But doing the inclination change, look, it's very expensive here. I'm up to about 248 meters per second. Unlike prograde and retrograde burns, normal burns, which are the purple ones, or radial burns, which are the sort of light blue ones, are the cheapest when you're farthest away from the parent body. So what we're going to do is not make our inclination fix here. In fact, I'm going to delete that node entirely. What I'm going to do instead is do my inclination change out here. To do this in the most efficient way I can, instead of aiming to get the apoapsis of my transfer orbit up to periapsis, I'm going to aim to get my apoapsis of my transfer orbit either at the DN or the AN. And I'm going to go for the DN because I'm coming around to here first. So I'm just going to move this prograde. Okay. So that apoapsis, and I'm just going to do, I don't know what altitude this ascending node is at, so I'm just going to have to do this with my eyeballs. Now, if I put a second maneuver here at the descending node and add the maneuver, notice here how my trajectory is coming down. That's why this is the ascending node. So I need to burn in a positive normal direction. So I'm going to burn like this. You can use your eyeballs to match it up here. Looks pretty good. You can also take a look at your inclination down here. I'm down at 0.2 degrees, which is definitely close enough. But the thing to notice is, don't go by this burn. This is the burn to get out there. Look at the details here. This normal burn is only 94 meters per second. So I've saved myself quite a lot of delta V by doing it out here rather than close to Kerbin. But let's delete this node for now, and then we'll perform the burn to get us out here. Slowing down. Just watching it. Again, really looking at the orbit rather than looking at the maneuver. And just when it looks about right, there we go. That looks good. We'll cut that. All right, so let's add our maneuver and put that normal correction back in here. Awesome. Okay, there we go. And yeah, our inclination's down to 0.1. That's going to be about right. But we also know, well, we got to still match this particular orbit here. So I could go up there and do this plane correction. And then after that, do another burn to, which is going to have to be a prograde burn to bring my periapsis up to where it needs to be. But if you combine the burns, I want you to notice that actually it is cheaper to do. So I'm going to do this just till it's approximately right. I don't know, around there. I know it's not quite right yet, but this is in the right ballpark. What I want you to do is, if we take a look at the specifics of this maneuver, I got myself a 96 meter per second normal part of the burn, and then I have a 388 meter per second prograde. But the total is about 400 meters per second. It's not just these two numbers added together. They are combined using the Pythagorean theorem. The crux of it is, the important thing to remember, is that this number is less than what these two numbers are added together. So if you can ever combine burns together, you will always save yourself fuel thanks to the magic of the Pythagorean theorem. So we're going to actually combine these two and do one burn up here that will get both the job done of fixing our inclination and getting our orbit out to where it needs to be. Now, one thing to notice is our inclination did get messed up with that. That's because our maneuver is on a bit of an angle, a jaunty slant. And so some of this prograde that I put in actually affected the normal part. So what I need to do, let's get back to this tool, is start, I think it's going to be anti-normal. We'll need to have more. Oh, that went the wrong way. I need to just, and I'm just looking at the numbers down here. I need to bring that back down to, there it is. Now our inclination's back down to 0. Our orbit's in the right ballpark, but it isn't right. We can see that it isn't right. And the reason it isn't right is because our apoapsis is out here, but our apoapsis is supposed to be here. Don't forget that this contract does have an argument of the periapsis of 352. Don't worry about the 352 and what that means. That's a topic in of itself. But what it does mean is the periapsis needs to be in this location as indicated. So I need to be able to move my periapsis from here over to here. How do I do that? Well, actually, that's what the final direction is. We've talked about prograde retrograde, which goes in line with the direction that you're moving. We've talked about normal and anti-normal, going north and south in this particular case. Last directions are these light blue ones called the radial directions. We have radial in, which points in towards the parent body, and we have radial out. And you can use the radial component of the burn to move your periapsis and apoapsis around. Now, we can actually see which way we need to go, because here's our predicted trajectory, this orange dotted line. But what we need it to do is to go along this green line. We're coming up from here, so we need to kind of pull this orange line towards the green line. So we're going to be doing some radial out. So if I start pulling on the radial out, notice how the orange line is approaching the green, but actually pay even more attention. The apoapsis is moving towards this apoapsis. So if I keep pulling, notice how the apoapsis are coming closer and closer together. Like, wow, that is really close. And as these two came together, so did the periapsis. They're always going to have to be opposite to each other. So now we got, if we take a look, 3 components going on in our burn. A prograde part, a normal part, and a radial part. And again, notice how the total is not just these 3 numbers added together, but it's using the Pythagorean theorem. Again, combining burns to help us save fuel. Now we can do more tweaking still to try and get all of this to be as precise as we can. A little more this way. So what do we got here? We got 1.683 kilometers on this end. We got a periapsis of 1.116, which is pretty much bang on. The locations of the predicted apoapsis and periapsis are pretty much bang on. If I take a look at my predicted inclination, it's 0, which is pretty much bang on. So this single burn, combining all three of these components together, will get the job done. Of course, we could have avoided having to do something so complicated by just paying attention to our insertion in the first place. And I mentioned that paying attention to your parking orbit's a good idea. I think I did. I apologize for making what is a pretty simple contract more complicated, but as you play this game, you will find yourself in situations like this, sometimes through a mistake, but often it won't be, and knowing how to save the mission can be pretty satisfying. And as I finish this burn, why don't I talk about the main takeaways from this episode? First, make sure to read these contracts closely. They can often have conditions that are easy to miss. I also looked at how to use the cheat menu to plan your missions, even when the Delta V maps aren't of any help. And finally, I looked at how to use not only the prograde direction, but also the normal and radial directions to manipulate your orbit to match the parameters you want. And with that, I'm going to be drawing this episode to a close. I hope you found it useful, and that I'll see you again for the next one.